Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malde, Senior Policy Analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, I chat with BPC's Senior Advisor, Theresa Cardinal Brown, about the role that recent high levels of immigration have played in driving the economy. Theresa and I then welcome back BPC Associate Director Emerson Sprick to discuss the role that increased immigration can play in securing Social Security, given forecasts that the Social Security trust funds are set to be depleted by 2033. Stay tuned.
In February, the Congressional Budget Office released its Budget and Economic Outlook from 2024 to 2034, forecasting that our labor force will have about 5.2 million more people in 2033 than the agency had projected last year. And most of this increase, they said, would come from immigration. Now, we have seen more immigration in recent years than was expected, with net immigration in 2023 estimated at 3.3 million compared to a 2019 projection that was only 1 million. So the forecasted economic gains for this additional population are actually staggering. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that between 2024 and 2034, GDP, gross domestic product, will be greater by about $7 trillion, and federal revenues will be greater by about $1 trillion. So this is a pretty big deal, but we want to dive into this a little more to find out what's underneath all of this. So this time I get to interview our host, Jack Malde, who's the economics expert. So Jack, let's delve into this in a little more detail. Why does CBO say we see these economic gains from this additional immigration?
Yeah, well, in a nutshell, immigrants are coming and they're joining our labor force. So they're working and they're producing goods and services which are really at the heart of our economy. And this increase in our labor force, there are really two aspects to it. So, firstly, more workers, a greater number of people actually working. But we also see, and the CBO points this out, that immigrants tend to have quite high labor force participation rates. So, a large proportion of them are at prime working age between the ages of 25 and 54. And so, a lot of them are working. And they actually have higher labor force participation rates than US-born workers do on the whole, or the US-born population. So that's also helping offset the decline in labor force participation that we've talked about on this podcast that we're seeing due to our aging population. So people, immigrants coming here and working, producing goods and services, but there are other impacts too. So more people in the economy means more consumer spending, which can stimulate investment. It obviously means more tax revenue, so more people working, they're paying into things like Social Security, which we're going to hear about on this podcast with our colleague Emerson Sprick. And there's also an perhaps under-discussed economic benefit from immigration in that it actually reduces inflationary pressures. So there's a recent report by the Brookings Institution which finds that the increased immigration that we're seeing can enable more jobs to be created in our economy without a corresponding increase in inflation. And this is because increased labor supply means that there's a decreased wages don't increase as much, and that so we don't see that sort of cost push inflation that comes with higher wages. So there really are quite a diverse range of economic benefits from immigration, but I think at the heart of it is that the increase in the labor force.
Mm-hmm. So according to CBO, who are the immigrants that are driving this increased numbers that they're projecting?
Yeah, so I can tell you who we aren't seeing. We aren't seeing that many people coming in on work visas, so on green cards and on temporary work visas. What the recent surge really has been is what the CBO calls this other foreign national category. So these are people coming in, a lot of them coming in on humanitarian parole, and so coming in for humanitarian reasons with a US sponsor. They're people who are being granted temporary protected status because we've decided it's not safe to send them back to their home countries. And we're seeing more people coming in seeking asylum. So we are seeing the surge of immigration on these humanitarian grounds. Now, that's of course not to say that this is not valuable immigration. These people do take jobs that we have, in areas that we're seeing shortages. But it is worth noting that we're not seeing this immigration in these channels, these work visa channels like green cards and temporary work visas.
Hmm. Well, you started talking about this a little bit, but, since these are newer arrivals, obviously, and many of them are coming, particularly the ones that are coming through the border are, they don't have a lot with them. What kind of jobs are they likely to take? And, there's always this question that comes up, are they taking jobs from US born workers?
Yeah, so it's difficult to know exactly what jobs these immigrants are taking. We can do modeling. So there was some recent modeling conducted by the Immigration Research Initiative. What they do is they look at immigrants in the country who have been in the United States for less than 2 years and who don't speak English very well, and they're making the assumption that these new immigrants will have perhaps similar labor market outcomes to these immigrants currently in the country. And so some of the positions that this modeling finds that these new immigrants might take include construction laborers, cashiers, housekeepers, and cooks. Many will also find work in occupations with slightly higher wages, such as retail salespeople, truck drivers, registered nurses, or nursing assistants. And they also find that this job mix changes as immigrants have been in the country for longer and they increase their English skills. So after 5 to 10 years, the model finds that in addition to those jobs I just mentioned, immigrants are likely to move into other jobs such as personal care aides, managers, chefs or head chefs, and even accountants. So we do see that assimilation, that change as time goes by. And yeah, Teresa, you also asked, are these immigrants taking jobs from US born workers? So, generally, no, the data does not show this. So, firstly, we have very low unemployment rates amongst US born workers. So, the unemployment rate averaged 3.6% in 2023, which is actually the lowest on record. And this firstly indicates that the recent surge in immigration is not causing high unemployment amongst US born workers. And just to add another data point here, we're seeing that the number of open vacancies in the economy largely exceeds the number of unemployed workers. So we've got 9.5 million job openings, but only about 6.5 million unemployed workers. That's a ratio of 1.5 vacancies per unemployed worker. So we're not seeing high unemployment among US born workers. We are actually seeing jobs increase for both US born workers and immigrants in recent years. And we do hear the claim from organizations such as the Center for Immigration Studies that immigrants are taking jobs from a very select portion of the US workforce. So they have made the claim that US born men without a bachelor's degree are seeing declining participation rates. But when we look at the data, it's not borne out from the data. So we're seeing that labor force participation rates, even for that specific group, has been increasing at a record pace in each of the last 2 years, and is actually currently above its COVID trend, above its pre-COVID trend, despite the very high levels of immigration we've seen in the past few years. So the data doesn't show that immigrants are taking US jobs. It's largely complementary and filling gaps in our workforce.
Yeah. So let's dive a little deeper. What assumptions does the CBO make in their forecast? Because they're predicting, a level of migration and what it's going to do in the future. And how does this compare to other population projections, such as we've seen from the Census Bureau when they put out their estimates, say, late last year?
Yeah, well, what the CBO does is they look at very recent data from, for example, the Department for Homeland Security on what immigration has been, even in 2023, and they're using this data to forecast out into the short term, and They make a few assumptions as well. They make assumptions that immigrants will generally receive work authorization after about 6 months. That won't be the case for everyone, but that will be, I think they make that as the average assumption. And yeah, you mentioned these other agencies make similar forecasts. So the Social Security Administration and the Census Bureau also make population projections. And what I found, I've looked into their assumptions. They're not as rigorous as the CBO. They don't actually make use of this very recent data on immigration from DHS. So they don't have this higher population growth due to immigration in the very short run. And I think, the CBO has gone further than the other two agencies. I think in the short run, at least, it's worth putting more stock into the CBO's estimates. All three agencies also look in the longer run. So that's when things get a little bit more difficult, or perhaps a lot more difficult to forecast. And we see clear divergence in the three agencies. So the CBO and the Census Bureau, they show that we do have declining population growth due to population aging. Interestingly, the Social Security Administration doesn't really show this through 2054. So they show quite robust population growth over the next few decades. And again, I was looking at the underlying assumptions here, and the CBO and the Census Bureau, which do find declining population growth, they're looking at historical trends in fertility rates and noting that fertility has been declining. It's below the replacement rate of roughly 2 children per woman, and they're assuming that this is a longer term trend that we will see. Whereas the Social Security Administration actually thinks that this has been a short term reduction in fertility, and that we will likely see a rebound to 2 children per woman. In part, this is because they think we're seeing women delaying childbirth to later on in their life, so that the recent reduction in fertility might be a shorter term phenomenon. And personally, I'm not 100% sure who's correct here. I would just note that the Social Security Administration seems to be the odd one out here, with this assumption that fertility will rebound to 2. So I would certainly caution, and I would, we're seeing 2 out of the 3 agencies forecasting declining population growth, which really underlines the importance of immigration.
Yeah. So we talked at the top about the economic gains that CBO is forecasting to come from this. And just to mention, in case people don't remember, the Congressional Budget Office's job is to predict what the impact to government revenues and expenditures will be from any legislative change. So one of the things, the reason they do these population estimates is because they have to kind of understand the underlying population as to who would be providing revenues or collecting benefits under any legislative change. And that's how they quote unquote score a bill. So this is their job in essence, to figure out the economic impact of different populations. But you talked about other kinds of things, not just tax revenue or benefits, but growth in the economy overall. What do you think we could do to get even greater economic gains from immigration, given that we're already predicting this $7 trillion difference?
Yeah, I mentioned at the start that we're seeing a very particular type of immigration at the moment. We're seeing people coming in on humanitarian reasons, and it can take some time for these individuals to gain work authorization and, as I mentioned earlier, to assimilate fully into the labor market. And I think we definitely need this type of immigration. I think it's really helpful for our economy, but I think we need to ensure more diverse immigration. So we need to get more people through these other channels, through work visas, coming in on green cards, coming in on temporary work visas. And I mean, the benefit, firstly, from that is these people have immediate work authorization. So they can contribute to our economy without any delay. And what we'd also see if we increased immigration through these channels is we'd see people taking jobs in a even wider range of sectors and occupations. We have shortages across many different industries and in many different occupations. So I think we do need to see just enable more diverse immigration. And we've spoken on the podcast previously about what can be done. We need Congress to act to raise these visa limits that have been set in law since 1990 to help reduce our visa backlog. And yeah, I think that is my key message here, is that let's just embrace immigration in all its forms.
Okay. Well, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll welcome Emerson Sprick to the podcast to take us through the role that increased immigration can play in securing Social Security solvency. So don't go anywhere. Welcome back. As many of you already know, Social Security is a federal program in the United States designed to provide retirement, disability, and survivor benefits to eligible Americans. It's funded through payroll taxes, and it serves as a critical source of income for millions, especially the elderly, disabled individuals, and families of deceased workers. But Social Security is in trouble, with the trust funds expected to be depleted by 2033. After this point, Social Security will have to rely solely on payroll taxes to pay out benefits to the current recipients. And beneficiaries won't be able to collect the full amount of their scheduled benefits because those payroll taxes will not cover all of those benefits. So, can immigration and the tax revenue that comes with it help save Social Security? To take us through this, we welcome back BPC Associate Director Emerson Sprick to the podcast. Great to have you, Emerson.
Thanks, Theresa. Great to be here.
All right. So we talked about it a little bit, but can you explain really the current state of Social Security solvency and why is it facing these challenges now?
Sure. Well, as you explained, the Social Security program is funded with payroll taxes that are withheld from nearly every American worker's paycheck. Up until just a few years ago, those payroll taxes surpassed the amount of money that was needed to pay out to beneficiaries. And so the Social Security Administration had the opportunity to build up a trust fund. Unfortunately, that relationship flipped just a few years ago, and based on SSA projections, that flip is more or less permanent. So now we have a situation where beneficiaries are still getting payouts, but only about 80% of those payouts are covered by the payroll taxes that come in. The other 20% has to be covered by drawing down from that trust fund. The problem is that SSA doesn't have the statutory authority to tap general revenues. And so once that trust fund is depleted, which, as you said, is projected to occur in 2033, benefits are going to have to be adjusted downward across the board by 20 to 25%.
So let's setting aside immigration, and you said this situation where there's not enough payroll taxes collected to pay out benefits. Without any legislation, that means the payroll cuts will come into effect automatically. So what are some of the things that are being considered? Obviously, you have a revenue and you have an expenditure side to this. So are those both being considered?
So the reason this is happening, at the end of the day, it's a math problem. There is either not enough money coming in to cover benefits, or the benefits going out are too expensive. And you have folks making philosophical arguments on either side, either that the payroll tax base or the tax rate hasn't kept up with our changing society, or benefits have grown too fast and that they've actually outstripped any kind of reasonable cost of living adjustments. Those are philosophical arguments, but there's a really kind of hard truth at the bottom of this. Regardless of where you set tax income or benefit levels, at a certain point, given those parameters, there have to be a certain sufficient number of workers paying payroll taxes that support each beneficiary. So in the early 2000s, which was just before the first baby boomers turned 62, which is the earliest age you can claim Social Security, this worker to beneficiary ratio was around 3.5 to 1. So 3.5 workers supporting in payroll taxes, each one beneficiary. But in 2022, that's gone down to 2.75 per 1. That's a 20% decline in the amount of workers supporting via payroll taxes each beneficiary. And that's projected to keep dropping pretty rapidly to just over 2. And so at the end of the day, that ratio is really, arguably the key metric for explaining why the Social Security program is in such dire financial straits.
Yeah, and that brings me on to my next question, Emerson. You're mentioning the number of workers. Obviously, one way to increase the number of workers in the economy is to allow for more immigration. So, we've spoken on this podcast about the CBO's projections that this recent surge in immigration will lead to a $1 trillion federal revenue boon over the next 10 years. This is partly because immigrants are generally of prime working age, so they have quite high labor force participation rates. So this suggests that increased immigration could be one approach to bolstering social security. But yeah, what do you make of that argument?
Well, I think there are a ton of economic arguments for increasing immigration for the economic good that immigrants do for the economy. Helping shore up Social Security and the Social Security Trust Fund is certainly one of those arguments. There's a reason that annual immigration under SSA's most optimistic trust fund projections is over 80% higher than it is under their most pessimistic projections, right? Just like you said, Jack, you know, immigrants tend to be younger, they tend to be workers, and bringing in more immigrants shores up that all important worker to beneficiary ratio, which lies at kind of the root of these Social Security problems.
So, Emerson, let me follow up with that. I mean, they're prime working age now, but they might retire and they do get to collect benefits if they have green cards at the end of the day. So, is immigration a long term solution to this?
That's definitely a more subtle question with a more nuanced answer. But you're exactly right that immigrants come to the country, they're working age, they pay taxes, and that helps in the short run. I am an optimist about the ability of increased immigration to help solve this problem, help mitigate this challenge in the long run for a couple reasons. First of all, Social Security Administration doesn't project anything close to the shock to that worker to beneficiary ratio as what we're seeing with the baby boomer generation in the future. So at the moment, we really do need this short run solution. We have what BPC's chief economist, Jason Fichtner, calls the peak 65 years. Between 2024 and 2027, more Americans than ever are turning 65. And after that, those numbers actually start to level out a little bit. And so the problem actually becomes a little bit more manageable if we can get through this really huge tranche of baby boomers. And so I think when we're talking about the ability of immigration to address this problem, yeah, if we bolster immigration with a one-time increase, that's not going to help because those workers are going to retire, they're going to draw down benefits, and that's just going to delay the onset of these fiscal problems. But as long as we're talking about a persistent increase in levels of immigration to this country, then I think that really can help address this problem for the long run because of the fact that we don't have another baby boomer generation coming up. The second reason I'm a little bit more optimistic, it's a little more nebulous, but I think that there's a lot of evidence that increasing immigration has the potential to strengthen the economy overall. And so strengthening the labor market, strengthening average earnings can really increase the amount of tax revenue that the government brings in. And so those economic benefits can have a multiplier effect.
Yeah, so clearly immigration is part of the solution. But I think what you're saying, Emerson, is it can't solve the problem by itself. It's very helpful, but we're going to need some other approaches too. So, what solutions does BPC focus on, and why do you focus on those solutions?
That's exactly right. So I think more than any individual solution, what BPC is focused on is addressing three things at once. A Social Security reform proposal has to shore up the program's finances. At the same time, for both political and practical reasons, it has to be a reform that increases the program's ability to meet the needs of the retirees who rely on the program the most. And while we're doing those two things, it only makes sense to bring the program into the 21st century, to improve some of the incentives for workers that were developed when households and working lives looked a lot different than they do today. And so, some of these solutions are things that are really controversial by themselves, things like raising the retirement age, things like raising the tax rate. What's more important than looking at any one individual solution is looking at what a package can do together. And so, a lot of our work is based on a 2016 report that was produced by a commission that we brought together here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And that commission report included 13 individual provisions that together would have accomplished all of these goals. It would have shored up the program for the foreseeable future. It would have bolstered income in retirement for the bottom 20% of lifetime earners by something like 30%. And it would have brought the program into the 21st century. And so, when we talk to folks on Capitol Hill and policymakers and other stakeholders, we are not sold on any one individual provision. We're looking at how can we work together in a way that can advance these goals and get bipartisan support and have a chance of actually passing to address this problem before 2033, when the trust fund becomes depleted.
I will tell you, this sounds an awful lot like how we talk about comprehensive immigration reform. It's not enough to just talk about what do we do with the undocumented or the border. We have to address legal immigration. We have to do it all together. That's
right.
hard enough for immigration. But so let me ask about Social Security. What are the prospects look like for this kind of reform?
I think they are probably brighter than most people think, and they still don't look great at the moment. I think both things are true. So at BPC, we have a lot of conversations with folks on Capitol Hill, and there really is a pretty widespread and a growing understanding among folks on the Hill that something has to happen. The problem, as you know, of course, is that Social Security is, quote unquote, the third rail of American politics.
Well, they say that about immigration too. So maybe we have multiple third rails, maybe a third, fourth, fifth, and sixth
That's
rail.
Right.
For all
We've
I know.
got a lot of rails on this subway system. But, I think that there continues to be a little bit of progress behind the scenes. And I'm really interested. I think the 119th Congress that we elect in November is going to be really pivotal. Up until now, at least in recent history, we have had the leaders of both parties, the de facto leaders, both President Biden and former President Trump, being fairly strongly opposed to touching the program, to reforms in any kind of comprehensive way. After the 2024 elections, I have decently high hopes that some folks on Capitol Hill will start to take the conversations that have been going on behind the scenes and bring them into the spotlight a bit more and start to really drive this conversation forward in a way that could result in some public policy actions in the next Congress or two.
Well, thank you for taking us through that, Emerson.
Thanks so much for having me.
We really appreciate you coming back, and we'll revisit this if Congress starts moving on either immigration reform or Social Security.
Sounds good. I'm optimistic by nature for both of us.
That sounds great.
Great to have you, Emerson.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malde. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.